Hey, welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy tonight's stories. Here we venture into the dark web, peeling back layers of mystery and terror to reveal tales that were never meant to be told. Leave a like and subscribe for more dark web scary stories. I found a dark web job offering $50,000 to babysit in a secret lab. The baby isn't human. I think we've all had that moment when we're scrolling through the internet late at night, looking for something interesting. It starts with just a peek, and before you know it, you're staring into the depths of the web, way past the regular stuff. For me, it was a mix of boredom and desperation. Bills were piling up, work had cut my hours, and I needed money fast. Then I found the post. It was in a shady forum buried under threads with names like Learn the Truth and The Things They Don't Want You to Know. The title was simple, almost plain. Looking for a reliable sitter, $50,000 for 1 week. Easy money. $50,000, I thought. That's got to be a typo. But the post didn't look like a scam. No strange links, no pleas for personal information. Just a short message, straight to the point. We're looking for someone willing to do an overnight babysitting job in a confidential location. 7 nights, payment upon completion. Candidates should be reliable, able to follow strict instructions, and willing to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Usually I'd scroll right past something like that. But $50,000? It was one of those numbers that, if you're in my situation, makes you ignore every red flag. Curiosity got the better of me and I clicked on the post. A chat box popped up and I typed, "Hey, I'm interested." Seconds later, I got a reply. Contact. Thank you for your interest. Are you able to come to our facility for an in-person interview tomorrow at 9 p.m? I hesitated. Most jobs don't schedule interviews at night, but the thought of that money drowned out my instincts. "Yeah," I replied, "I can be there." The response was almost instant. "Perfect. We will send the location tomorrow morning. Please be on time." The next day, I woke up wondering if it was a bad dream. But no, there it was, a message in my inbox with a GPS pin. I clicked on it, and it zoomed in on a blank spot on the map, about an hour's drive from my place. No town names, no nearby roads, just coordinates in the middle of nowhere. As the day wore on, I tried convincing myself it was too risky. But every time I thought about backing out, that $50,000 loomed larger in my mind. It was just a week after all. And how bad could it be? By 8:30 p.m., I was on the road. The drive was unsettling. The GPS took me off the main highway pretty quickly, leading me on to smaller, rougher roads. At first, there were streetlights, houses, signs of civilization, but those slowly disappeared, replaced by thick woods on either side. My only companion was the sound of gravel crunching under my tires and the faint hum of the radio. Finally, my GPS chirped, "Arrived at your destination." I parked on the side of the road, looking around. There was nothing there, just trees and darkness. I started to think I'd been pranked when I noticed a narrow, overgrown path leading into the forest. My phone buzzed with another message. "Walk down the path. We'll meet you at the gate." I shivered, but I'd come this far. I grabbed my flashlight, took a deep breath, and headed down the trail. The path seemed to stretch forever, the trees crowding around me, branches scratching at my jacket as I walked. I kept thinking I saw shadows flickering in the corners of my vision, just beyond the beam of my flashlight. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing. Finally, the path opened up to a small clearing. At the center was a tall metal fence, with a gate in the middle and a guard standing beside it, dressed in black with a cap pulled low over his face. "You're here for the interview?" he asked, his voice gruff. I nodded, barely able to make out his face in the dim light. He glanced at his watch, then nodded toward the gate. "You're on time. Good. Follow me." The guard led me through the gate and down a short paved path. That's when I saw it, a large, squat building with no windows and a single door at the front. It was the kind of place that didn't want to be found. Inside, the walls were concrete, bare and cold, with only a few fluorescent lights flickering overhead. The guard led me down a hallway where every footstep echoed in the silence. Finally, he stopped outside a plain metal door, knocked twice, and opened it. "Your candidate's here," he announced. A man in a white lab coat sat behind a desk in the middle of the room. He looked up at me, and I could feel his eyes sizing me up. He didn't look like a scientist, more like an accountant who'd stumbled into the wrong job. Thin, glasses, greying hair. But there was something off about his eyes, like he'd seen things he didn't want to talk about. "Please, take a seat," he said, motioning to a chair in front of the desk. I sat, trying to act casual, like I wasn't freaking out. The guy didn't waste any time. "You're here because we need someone discreet and dependable, someone who can follow instructions without asking questions." He folded his hands, leaning forward. "The task is simple. You will stay here overnight, observing a subject in the laboratory. You will not interfere. You will not communicate with the subject. You will simply watch." He paused, as if letting that sink in. I wasn't sure what to say, so I just nodded, trying to hide the growing sense of dread creeping up my spine. Understand that once you sign the agreement, there's no backing out. If you breach confidentiality or attempt to leave before your week is up, there will be consequences. The way he said consequences sent a shiver down my spine. But $50,000 was $50,000, and I was all in at this point. "Do you have any questions?" he asked, his tone indicating that he wasn't expecting any. "What's the subject?" I blurted out before I could stop myself. The man's eyes narrowed, and for a split second I thought he wouldn't answer. But finally, he spoke, each word deliberate. "The subject is unique, something not of this world, you might say, but you won't need to worry about that. Just follow the instructions we give you, and you'll be safe." The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. Finally, he slid a stack of papers across the desk. "Sign here, if you're still interested, of course." I picked up the pen, my hands shaking slightly, and scrawled my name. After signing the papers, I was led down another long, narrow hallway. The concrete walls seemed to press in on me, and the buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead was almost deafening in the silence. I tried to focus on my breathing, keep calm, remind myself why I was here, $50,000 for 1 week. But each step made that number feel smaller, like it wasn't worth what I was getting myself into. At the end of the hallway was another heavy metal door, this one with a small, round window near the top. The guard stepped forward, pulled out a keycard, and swiped it through a reader. There was a faint beep, and the door clicked open. "Your room is just through there," he said, nodding for me to go inside. The room was stark and cold, with a single chair positioned in front of a large glass panel that stretched from wall to wall. It was the kind of glass that looked thick, reinforced, like you'd see in a maximum security prison. And on the other side, that's where the subject was. I couldn't see it clearly. The lights in the room beyond the glass were dimmed, casting strange shadows that made it hard to make out any specific shapes. But something was moving back there, something large. The shadows twisted and shifted, almost in a rhythm, as if it was breathing. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The guard cleared his throat, drawing my attention back to him. He handed me a clipboard with a list of rules. Rules: do not attempt to communicate with the subject. Under no circumstances should you enter the containment room. Report any unusual behavior immediately via the intercom on the wall. The observation period is from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. You are not permitted to leave until 6 a.m. I read the list twice, feeling a little sick. I'd expected rules, but something about how specific they were, especially the part about not entering the room, made my skin crawl. "Someone will come by in the morning to relieve you," the guard said, his voice flat, almost rehearsed. "Stick to the rules, and everything will be fine." And then he was gone, leaving me alone with whatever was on the other side of the glass. I sat in the chair, clutching the clipboard, staring into that darkened room. The first few hours passed in a sort of tense silence. Every so often I'd catch a glimpse of movement, a shadow that seemed to stretch and contract, but it never got close enough to the glass for me to make out any details. The air in the room was thick, stale, with a faint chemical smell that made my nose wrinkle. I tried to keep my eyes open, keep alert, but the longer I sat there, the more tired I felt. My head started to droop, my eyelids growing heavy. That's when I heard it, a soft, scratching noise, like nails on metal. I jolted awake, my heart hammering in my chest as I scanned the room. The sound was coming from the other side of the glass. I leaned forward, squinting into the shadows, and for the first time I saw it, a shape moving closer to the glass, slowly, deliberately. It was hunched over, its limbs long and thin, almost spidery, and as it got closer I could see hands. Pale, bony fingers pressed against the glass, tracing slow, deliberate lines across the surface. My stomach twisted, and I had to remind myself to breathe. The thing on the other side tilted its head, as if it could see me through the one-way glass, like it knew I was there, watching. It pressed its hand flat against the glass, and for a moment I thought I saw its face, eyes too large, too dark, staring right at me. I scrambled back in my chair, heart pounding. I'd been warned not to communicate, so I sat there, frozen, my mind racing. Whatever this thing was, it was studying me, watching me just as much as I was supposed to be watching it. The scratching continued, slow and steady, like it was trying to wear me down. I checked the clock on the wall. It was just past 3 a.m. Only 3 more hours. Just 3 more hours, and then I could leave. I glanced around the room, my eyes landing on the intercom. "Report any unusual behavior," the rules had said. I reached for it, hesitating. What was I even supposed to say? That it was scratching? I pressed the button, whispering, It's moving, scratching on the glass." My voice sounded shaky, weaker than I'd like, but it was all I could manage. A few seconds later, a voice crackled through the intercom. It was the man from before, the one in the lab coat. "Understood. Remain in your seat. Do not engage." The intercom clicked off and I was alone again. I sat back, trying to steady my breathing. The scratching had stopped, but I could still feel its presence on the other side of the glass. It was just standing there, motionless, its dark shape blending with the shadows. Then around 4:30 a.m., things got worse. The lights in the containment room started flickering, casting quick, strobe-like flashes across the figure on the other side. And in those brief moments of light, I saw more of it than I ever wanted to. It was crouched, its limbs twisted at impossible angles, its skin pale and almost translucent, stretched tight over bones that looked too sharp, too thin. And its eyes, they were black, empty, like twin voids staring back at me. My hands were shaking, my heart racing. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. It was like being trapped in a nightmare, and every flicker of the lights made the creature look even more unnatural, more wrong. Suddenly the lights went out completely. The room plunged into darkness, and I could feel the panic clawing up my throat. I gripped the edge of my chair, straining to see, to hear anything. The silence was suffocating. Then from the darkness I heard it, a soft, whispering sound, so faint I could barely make it out. But it was there, filling the room, like the creature was murmuring something, words I couldn't understand. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt an overwhelming urge to get up, to run. But the rules echoed in my mind. Do not leave until 6 a.m. I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to block out the whispers, but they seemed to seep into my mind, filling my thoughts with a strange, sinking dread. It was like the creature was in my head, whispering things I didn't want to hear, didn't want to know. And just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the lights snapped back on, blinding me for a moment. I blinked, squinting against the sudden brightness, and when my vision cleared, I saw nothing. The creature was gone. The room on the other side of the glass was empty, as if it had never been there at all. I sat there, breathing hard, my body trembling. Had it left? Or was it still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the lights to go out again? The last hour dragged by in unbearable silence. I kept glancing at the clock, counting down the minutes, every tick feeling like a lifetime. When the door finally opened and the guard stepped in to relieve me, I practically jumped out of my seat. "Everything all right?" he asked, his tone casual, like this was just another shift change. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He didn't push for details, just gave me a knowing look before nodding toward the hallway. "See you back here tonight." I stumbled down the hallway, barely able to focus, my mind racing with questions I didn't dare ask. As I stepped outside, the first rays of dawn were just beginning to break over the trees. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the cool, fresh air, trying to shake off the memories of the night. It was only as I got in my car and started driving home that I realized something. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked wrong. My eyes looked darker, hollow, like I hadn't slept in days. And in the faint light of dawn, I thought just for a second, I saw something shift in the back seat, a shadow, there one moment and gone the next. I glanced back, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Or maybe I barely slept after that first night. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see that twisted, hunched figure staring back at me. Or I'd hear that faint scratching, that whispering that seemed to burrow into my mind. But $50,000. It kept me coming back. Each morning, I'd tell myself it was just one more night, just a few more hours. And yet by nightfall, I'd be driving back to that isolated facility, like something was pulling me back against my better judgment. The next night, I tried to prepare myself. I got there right on time, took my seat in front of the glass, and braced myself for whatever lay in the shadows. But as I settled in, I noticed something different. There was a faint light in the containment room tonight, just enough to see that the glass was smeared with strange, hand-shaped marks like it had been touched, pressed on, almost like fingerprints. But they were long and stretched, the fingers too thin, leaving greasy trails along the glass. I shivered and glanced over at the intercom. I debated calling it in, but decided against it. They hadn't seemed concerned last night, so I figured it was best to just sit tight. Around midnight, I heard the soft hum of machinery. The lights in the containment room grew brighter, and then I saw it. My heart dropped. In the middle of the room was a crib. Not a hospital bed, not some reinforced cage. Just a simple, old-fashioned crib, like something you'd see in a nursery, with pale blue sheets and a mobile that spun gently overhead. But there was something off about it, like the bars were too close together, the mattress too thin. It was an empty shell, but it radiated a kind of coldness that made me uneasy. That's when I heard it, a faint, almost rhythmic sound. It started as a low rumble, building slowly, a sound so out of place it took me a moment to realize what it was. It was crying. Not a human cry, though. It was distorted, layered with a strange echo, like it was coming from underwater or through a thick wall. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I was supposed to be babysitting this thing, but whatever was in that crib didn't sound remotely human. I leaned forward, peering through the glass, trying to make out any details. All I could see were shadows, but as I stared, I noticed a small shape moving slowly in the crib. It looked like a baby, but it wasn't moving like one. It was twitching, almost spasming, as if something was wrong, something that made its limbs twist in unnatural angles. The crying got louder, filling the observation room, and I gripped the edges of my chair, trying to keep myself steady. My mind raced with questions I didn't want to answer. What kind of baby was this? Why was it here? And most importantly, why did they need someone to watch it? Then all of a sudden, the crying stopped. Silence filled the room, thick and oppressive, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. The figure in the crib went still, its head turning slowly, almost mechanically, until it was facing the glass. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and hollow, like it was sizing me up, measuring me. And then, without warning, it let out a low, rattling growl, like it was trying to speak, but couldn't form the words. I leaned back, instinctively distancing myself from the glass. The thing in the crib twitched again, and then it started crawling. Slowly, deliberately, it pulled itself over the edge of the crib, its limbs bending in ways that made my stomach churn. It dropped to the floor, landing with a dull thud, and started shuffling toward the glass, each movement jerky and unnatural, like it didn't quite know how to use its own body. I could feel my breath quicken, my heart pounding as it got closer and closer. Part of me wanted to run, to get as far away from that room as possible. But the rules echoed in my mind. Do not leave until 6 a.m. I gritted my teeth, clenching my fists, trying to steady myself as the creature pressed up against the glass, its fingers splayed out, leaving those greasy, smeared marks. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could see its mouth, a twisted, gaping hole that seemed too large for its small frame. It let out another low, guttural sound, a mixture of a whimper and a snarl, pressing its face against the glass as if it was trying to break through. My skin crawled, and I forced myself to look away, focusing on the clock on the wall. Only 2 a.m. 4 more hours to go. The creature scratched at the glass, its nails dragging slowly, painfully, leaving faint lines in the surface. I felt trapped, suffocated by the sound, by the relentless scratching that seemed to burrow into my mind. I tried to focus on my breathing, to calm myself down, but every time I glanced back, it was still there, watching me with those dark, empty eyes, like it was waiting for something. Around 3 a.m. things took a turn. The lights in the containment room flickered, dimming just enough to cast long, distorted shadows across the floor. And then, without warning, the creature moved away from the glass. It retreated back to the crib, its movements slow and calculated, like it knew exactly what it was doing. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, feeling a small surge of relief as it settled back in the shadows. But that relief was short-lived. The intercom crackled to life, and I nearly jumped out of my seat. The voice on the other end was calm, emotionless. Observation period will proceed as usual. Do not attempt to interact. Yeah, got it," I stammered, barely able to keep the tremor out of my voice. But something about the voice felt wrong. It sounded flat, almost mechanical, like whoever was speaking was just reading from a script. And then, as the intercom clicked off, I heard something else, a faint tapping on the glass. I turned, half expecting the creature to be there, but the glass was empty. The tapping continued, rhythmic, coming from the left side of the room. I stared, squinting, trying to make out any shapes in the dim light. Then I saw it, a small handprint on the glass, right at eye level. But it wasn't from the creature. This handprint was too small, too human. I swallowed, a cold knot of fear settling in my stomach as I looked around, trying to make sense of it. That's when I felt it, a soft breath on the back of my neck. I whipped around, heart pounding, but there was no one there, just the empty room, the cold walls, and the eerie silence. My mind raced, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, or maybe the air vent. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. This place, it was messing with me, getting inside my head. I glanced at the clock. 4 a.m., 2 more hours. The rest of the night passed in a blur of tense silence and half-seen shadows. The creature stayed in the crib, barely moving, its dark eyes staring unblinkingly at the ceiling. I tried to focus on anything but the oppressive silence, on the faint hum of the lights, the ticking of the clock. But every so often I'd catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a flash of movement, a shadow shifting, and always that handprint on the glass, haunting me, reminding me that I wasn't alone. Finally 6 a.m. arrived. The guard entered, his face as blank as ever, and I bolted out of the chair, barely sparing him a glance as I headed for the door. I needed to get out, to breathe fresh air, to put as much distance between myself and that room as possible. As I drove home, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that twisted figure in the back seat. But it was empty, just me and the pale morning light filtering through the trees. And yet, even as I pulled into my driveway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I stepped inside my house, I froze. There, on the window by my front door, was a faint handprint. Small, childlike, just like the one I'd seen in the observation room. I scrubbed it off, my heart racing, telling myself it was just dirt, a smudge. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever was in that lab, it wasn't staying there. I told myself I'd never go back. After seeing that handprint on my own window, I wanted nothing more to do with that place, with that thing in the crib. But that night, just as the sun was setting, my phone buzzed. I almost didn't want to look, but curiosity got the better of me. Your shift starts in 1 hour. Failure to report will result in breach of contract and consequences. I stared at the message, my heart pounding. Consequences. The word lingered in my mind, dark and heavy. What kind of consequences? I didn't know, and honestly I didn't want to find out. But something inside me, some primal fear, told me they meant it. They wouldn't just let me walk away. I got into my car, each mile back to the facility, feeling like a step into the mouth of something monstrous. By the time I arrived, the guard was already waiting for me at the gate, his face expressionless as ever. "Right on time," he said, barely glancing at me. I didn't respond, just nodded and followed him down the now familiar hallway. My footsteps echoed off the concrete, and with each step I felt the dread building, a weight pressing down on my chest. When I entered the observation room, I froze. The crib was gone. In its place was a small black chair, much like the one I was sitting in, positioned in the center of the containment room. For a moment I thought the room was empty. But then I saw it. A shadowy figure slouched in the chair, its back turned to me. Even from this angle I could see that it was too thin, its limbs long and bony, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I sat down, forcing myself to look at the figure. Every instinct told me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, but the rules echoed in my mind. Do not leave until 6 a.m. The intercom crackled to life, startling me out of my thoughts. Tonight's observation will proceed as usual, said the same cold, mechanical voice. Report any unusual behavior. I wanted to laugh. What part of this wasn't unusual? But I stayed silent, gripping the edge of my chair, my eyes fixed on the figure in the room. For the first few hours, the figure didn't move. It just sat there, perfectly still, its back to me, its head slightly tilted. But as the hours dragged on, I began to feel a strange sensation, like the air in the room was thickening, growing colder. I rubbed my arms, trying to shake off the chill, but it clung to me, seeping into my skin. And then, around 2 a.m., I heard it, a faint whispering sound, so quiet I almost thought I was imagining it. I strained to listen, leaning forward in my chair. The sound was coming from the intercom, like someone was speaking in a low, hurried voice, just out of reach. At first, I couldn't make out any words. It was just a steady stream of murmurs filling the room, echoing off the walls. But as I listened, the whispers grew louder, and I began to pick out fragments, words that seemed to weave together in a strange, haunting rhythm. Not alone. Watching. It knows. The words sent a shiver down my spine. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block out the whispers, but they seemed to seep into my mind, growing louder and louder until they were all I could hear. And then, just as suddenly as they'd started, the whispers stopped. I took a shaky breath, glancing around the room, trying to shake off the lingering sense of dread. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The figure in the chair had moved. It was still slouched over, but its head was now turned slightly to the side, as if it was listening, watching me. I wanted to get up to run out of the room, but I felt rooted to the spot, my eyes locked on the figure. Slowly it began to move, its head turning inch by inch, until it was facing the glass, its dark, hollow eyes fixed on me. My breath caught in my throat. I could feel its gaze boring into me, cold and unfeeling, like it was studying me, dissecting me with its eyes. And then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, it spoke. "Help! Me!" The words hung in the air, twisting my insides. Help it? I wasn't even sure what it was, but the voice, it sounded human, fragile, desperate. I swallowed, trying to steady myself, but my hands were shaking. What do you want?" I whispered, forgetting the rules in my fear. The figure didn't answer. It just kept staring at me, its eyes dark and empty, like twin black holes drawing me in. And then, slowly, it raised one hand, pointing to the intercom on the wall. I hesitated, my mind racing. The rules were clear. Do not attempt to communicate. But the figure's gaze was unyielding, its hand still outstretched, and I felt a strange compulsion, like it was drawing me in, guiding my movements. I stood up, my legs trembling, and crossed the room to the intercom. My finger hovered over the button, my heart pounding in my chest, and then with a deep breath I pressed it. For a moment there was nothing but silence, but then a voice crackled through the speaker, faint and distorted. "Thank you for listening." I froze, my hand still on the intercom. The voice wasn't coming from the other side, it was coming from inside the room. Slowly I turned, my eyes locking onto the figure in the chair. Its head was tilted forward, its face obscured by shadows, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and unyielding. "Help me!" it whispered again, its voice filled with a sadness that chilled me to the bone. What do you need?" I stammered, barely able to get the words out. The figure raised its hand again, pointing to the door on the far side of the room, the one I'd been instructed never to open. My heart raced, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to sit down, to leave. But something in its voice, in those hollow, pleading eyes, pulled me forward. I walked to the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. A faint voice echoed in my mind, a warning from the depths of my own fear. Do not enter the containment room, but I ignored it, compelled by a force I couldn't explain. Just as my fingers brushed the handle, the intercom crackled to life again. Return to your seat immediately. The voice was cold, devoid of any warmth, but I could hear something else beneath it, a hint of anger, of urgency. I hesitated, my hand frozen on the handle. Behind me, the figure let out a low, guttural moan, a sound filled with pain and desperation. "Please," it whispered, barely more than a breath. I closed my eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. Then reluctantly, I let go of the handle and backed away from the door, returning to my seat. The figure's gaze followed me, its hollow eyes filled with a quiet, haunting sorrow. I sat there, staring at it, my heart pounding, a strange mix of fear and pity churning in my stomach. I didn't know what it was or what it wanted, but I could feel its pain, its desperation, like a weight pressing down on my chest. The rest of the night passed in silence, the figure's eyes never leaving mine. And when the clock finally struck 6 a.m., I felt a wave of relief so intense I nearly collapsed. As I stumbled out of the room, the guard was waiting for me, his face as expressionless as ever. He didn't ask me anything, didn't offer any explanations. He just nodded, as if everything that had happened was perfectly normal. But as I left the facility and stepped into the cold morning air, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was in that room, it was suffering. And I had a terrible feeling that it wouldn't let me leave so easily. When I got home, I found another handprint on my window. But this time it wasn't small or childlike. It was large, with long, bony fingers smudged in a dark, oily stain that made my skin crawl. And in that moment, I knew I hadn't left it behind. I didn't want to go back. After seeing that handprint on my window, after hearing its voice inside my head, everything in me screamed to stay away. But that night, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I received another message. Tonight is your last shift. Report by 9 p.m. Final instructions will be given. I tried to tell myself I could skip it, that I could just block the number, forget any of this ever happened. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. This wasn't the kind of job you just walked away from. And as much as I didn't want to admit it, I felt an odd pull to go back, like that creature was calling to me, luring me in, and I was powerless to resist. At 9 p.m. sharp, I found myself back at the facility. The guard was there, waiting for me at the gate, his face unreadable as usual. He led me inside, down the long, silent hallway, to the door of the observation room. Before I entered, he handed me a new list of instructions. Final instructions. Under no circumstances are you to enter the containment room. If the subject attempts to communicate, ignore it. When the lights go out, remain in your seat and wait for further instructions. This is your last night. I glanced up at the guard, feeling a lump of dread settle in my stomach. What happens after tonight? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He looked at me, his eyes cold and empty. Your job will be complete, he said simply. Just follow the instructions. I entered the observation room, feeling the weight of the door closing behind me, sealing me in. Tonight, the lights in the containment room were dimmer than ever, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. And in the center of the room was the figure, sitting in that small black chair, its head slumped forward, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles. I sat down, gripping the edges of my seat, my eyes fixed on the figure. I could feel the familiar sense of dread building, a suffocating weight pressing down on me. The creature didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was overwhelming, filling the room with an unnatural chill. Hours passed in silence, the minutes dragging by like hours. The figure remained still, its head tilted forward, its dark eyes hidden beneath the shadows. I kept my gaze locked on it, afraid to look away, afraid that if I blinked, it would be right there, pressed against the glass. Around 3 a.m., the lights in the observation room flickered, casting the room in darkness for a few terrifying moments. When they came back on, my heart skipped a beat. The figure was no longer sitting in the chair. It was standing, facing the glass, its dark eyes fixed on me, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. My skin crawled, and I gripped the edges of my chair, my mind screaming at me to look away, but I couldn't. I was trapped, paralyzed by its gaze, unable to move, unable to breathe. Then, without warning, the lights in the containment room went out completely, plunging the figure into darkness. I sat there, heart pounding, staring into the black void, waiting, listening. And that's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing through the silence, growing louder, closer, until they were right on the other side of the glass. My breath caught in my throat, and I forced myself to look, to face whatever was there. But all I saw was darkness, an endless void stretching out in front of me. Then a faint whisper drifted through the silence, soft and cold, filling the room. "I'm coming." The voice sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. I looked around the room, my eyes darting from the intercom to the door, searching for any way out. But there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The lights flickered back on, and I nearly screamed. The figure was pressed against the glass, its face inches from mine, its dark eyes staring into my soul, unblinking, empty. Its mouth was twisted into a wide, unnatural smile, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. I stumbled back in my chair, my heart racing, my mind screaming at me to run. Then slowly, it raised its hand and pressed it against the glass, leaving a dark, greasy stain. Its fingers were long and thin, each nail sharp and pointed like claws. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I was trapped, paralyzed by its gaze, by the silent, unyielding horror of its presence. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure pulled away, retreating into the shadows, its twisted form disappearing into the darkness. The room fell silent again, and I sat there, trembling, my hands shaking, barely able to breathe. The clock on the wall read 5:30 a.m., only half an hour left. I sat there, counting down the minutes, my eyes darting back and forth, waiting for it to return, for the lights to go out, for anything. But the room remained silent, the darkness beyond the glass empty. Finally 6 a.m. arrived, the door opened, and the guard stepped inside, his face as blank as ever. He didn't say anything, didn't even look at me. He just nodded toward the hallway, and I stumbled out of the room, barely able to stand. As I walked down the hallway, I felt a strange sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I'd survived. It was over, or so I thought. As I stepped outside, the first rays of dawn casting a pale light over the facility, I felt a strange, nagging sensation in the back of my mind, like something was watching me. I glanced over my shoulder, but the facility was silent, empty. The guard had already disappeared, and there was no one else in sight. I got into my car, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, to shake off the lingering sense of dread. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, lurking just out of sight. When I got home, I went straight to bed, hoping that a few hours of sleep would be enough to put this nightmare behind me. But when I woke up, I found something waiting for me. On my bedroom window was a handprint, dark and oily, with long, thin fingers, just like the one I'd seen in the observation room. My stomach twisted, and I backed away, feeling a cold wave of terror wash over me. I scrubbed the handprint off, telling myself it was nothing, just a smudge, a trick of the light. But over the next few days, the handprints started appearing everywhere, on my mirrors, my windows, even on the walls. No matter how many times I cleaned them, they always came back, dark and greasy, like a stain I couldn't get rid of. And then at night, I'd hear it. The faint sound of scratching coming from somewhere inside my house, echoing through the silence. Sometimes I'd hear whispers, soft and cold, filling my mind, pulling me back into that dark room. "I'm coming." I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew the truth. I hadn't left it behind. It had followed me, lingering in the shadows, watching, waiting. And every night I'd see it, just a glimpse, a shadow in the corner of my eye, a dark figure lurking in the edges of my vision, its hollow eyes fixed on me, its twisted mouth stretching into a grin. I don't know how much longer I can take this. I don't know what it wants, or why it chose me, but I can feel it, getting closer, slipping further into my life, into my mind. And now, every night, as the darkness settles in, I hear its voice, soft and cold, filling the silence. "I'm coming." I know it's only a matter of time before it gets here, and when it does, I don't think I'll be able to escape. I found a dark web video of paranormal events happening in my hometown. The next one is scheduled for my house. All right, so before I even start, I just want to say, don't go looking around the dark web if you don't know what you're doing. I thought I was just messing around, looking for some creepy stories, maybe some old forum threads. I had no idea what I'd stumble across, and honestly, I'm still not sure what's real and I don't even know. I can't get it out of my head, and now I feel like I'm watching my back every second. But, yeah, let me back up and start from the beginning. This all started a couple of weeks ago. I'd been on a horror binge, checking out creepypasta stories, watching scary videos, and, getting that Halloween adrenaline rush. But the regular stuff was getting kind of stale, so like an idiot, I decided to dig a little deeper, check out some forums where people were talking about the real scary stuff. Someone posted a link saying, if you want to see something really messed up, check out this channel. They claimed it was a live feed of supernatural stuff happening around random towns. It sounded super fake, and I was convinced it was some kind of prank. But I was curious, so I clicked. The site was weird, all dark and glitchy, but there was a stream going. The title just said, "Unusual Events," with the date and time. I sat there watching, expecting a jump scare or something, but instead I saw this quiet scene of a small, empty town square. It looked almost like my hometown, but wasn't exactly the same. The streets were empty, and there was this eerie quiet that felt wrong, like the whole place was just waiting for something. I watched for a couple of minutes, almost bored, and then something shifted. In the middle of the square, a shadow appeared. It was subtle, barely there, but it slowly grew darker, almost like it was solidifying. I tried to convince myself it was just a person, but there was no one there. It was just this thing getting bigger and bigger. It hung there like a cloud of smoke, but it was completely still. Then suddenly it just vanished. I thought it was some kind of glitch, like a camera malfunction, but then I saw the timestamp in the corner. The shadow disappeared at exactly 3:33 a.m. Okay, creepy, right? But I still figured it was all fake. Someone just edited the footage or something. I mean, it was the dark web. You can't trust anything on there. I clicked off and went to bed, thinking that was that. Except the next day, I woke up to a message from an anonymous user. It was on a burner email I'd used only a few times, and I had no idea how they got it. The message was simple. Next stream, your town. 3:33 a.m. That made my stomach drop. I wanted to ignore it, tell myself it was just someone messing with me, but the curiosity was eating at me. So, against all common sense, I clicked the link again that night. This time, the title said my town's name. It felt weird to see it, like whoever ran this channel actually knew where I lived. The same empty scene loaded up on the stream, just a random street in the middle of town, completely quiet. I didn't recognize it at first because I don't go downtown much, but then I noticed the bench by the bus stop, the one with the old graffiti scratched into the metal. I used to sit there every morning in high school. The minutes ticked by slowly, 3:31, 3:32, and then, just like the night before, I saw something start to take shape. This time it wasn't a shadow, it was a figure, almost like a person, but distorted. The shape was just wrong. It was thin, too thin, almost like it was stretched out. Its head was tilted to the side in a way that made me feel sick. It stood there, still as stone, and then, right as the clock hit 3:33, its head snapped around like it was looking right into the camera, like it could see me. I swear, I felt its eyes on me, even though it didn't have any. And then, just like before, it vanished. I was too creeped out to sleep that night. I kept replaying the image in my head, that twisted figure staring straight through the screen at me. The next day, I was exhausted, jumpy at every little sound, but I tried to brush it off as lack of sleep. I figured it was just a scare tactic, right? Some hacker trying to make people paranoid. But then I got another message. Next stream, your street, 3:33 a.m. I didn't even know what to do with that. I was freaked out, but I thought, all right, if I don't watch, maybe it won't happen. Or maybe they just want to mess with me and will move on when they realize I'm not playing their game. But midnight rolled around, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. I was too wired to sleep, so I ended up opening the stream again. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I could catch them in the act, prove it was fake somehow. This time, the view was from my actual street corner. I recognized the lamppost and the faded street sign. The camera was set up so that I could see my own house in the background, faintly lit by the streetlight. My heart was pounding. I felt like I was watching myself from the outside. Every instinct was screaming at me to shut it off, but I couldn't. Just before 3:33, I saw something flicker in the corner of the screen. The shadow was back, only this time it didn't stop at the corner. It started moving toward my house. Slowly, almost like it was gliding, it crossed the street and stopped in my driveway. I was frozen, staring at my screen, too scared to move or even breathe. It reached the edge of the frame and then paused right by my front door. My phone buzzed and I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was another message from that anonymous user. Just 2 words. Look outside. I couldn't. I wanted to, but I was too terrified. I didn't know if this was real, a prank, or some elaborate psychological trick. But at that moment, I didn't care. I felt watched, violated, like there was something out there that shouldn't be. The next morning, I tried to brush it off as a dream, like maybe I'd just imagined the whole thing. But when I went outside, I saw footprints leading up to my front door. They weren't normal footprints, though. They were distorted, long and stretched out, like someone had dragged their feet through the dirt. I swear I hadn't imagined it. Something had been there. And now I can't shake the feeling that something's still watching me, It's like I'm being haunted, stalked by something that I invited in. I've been getting the same message every night since then, telling me to check the stream, but the last one I got changed everything. Next stream, inside your house, 3:33 a.m. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The message, next stream, inside your house, 3:33 a.m., kept flashing in my mind. Just imagining it made me feel like I was trapped, like I couldn't escape. Every creak, every little sound in the house felt amplified, like my walls were alive, pressing in on me, trying to breathe with me. I sat on the edge of my bed, phone in hand, watching the time crawl toward 3:33 a.m. It was quiet, too quiet, but every instinct in my body told me to keep the lights off. I thought if I stayed in the dark, maybe it would just pass. Maybe this thing, whatever it was, would ignore me. But then that damn notification buzzed on my phone, lighting up my face in the dark. Stream starting now. I didn't want to look. I really didn't. But curiosity, fear, whatever it was, it overpowered me. With trembling hands, I opened the stream. The screen was pitch black at first, like the camera hadn't adjusted to the light. And then slowly, something came into focus. I froze. It was my living room. I stared at my phone, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The camera was set up right there, in my own house, capturing the empty room in eerie silence. I hadn't heard anyone break in. There was no sign of anything out of place. But somehow, they were in. My stomach twisted as I realized I wasn't safe, not even in my own home. The camera shifted slightly like someone was holding it and walking through the room. I wanted to scream, call the cops, do something, but I was paralyzed. I just watched as the camera moved from the living room to the hallway, inching closer and closer to my bedroom door. The stream was eerily silent, except for the faint sound of breathing. I couldn't tell if it was the person holding the camera, or if it was something else. The breathing was heavy, almost labored, like it took a lot of effort. The camera stopped right outside my door. I could see the faint outline of my doorframe, barely lit by the light creeping in under the door. Then, in the stream, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft, distorted whisper like static, but I could make out the words. Come out and see me. The whisper felt like it was crawling through the phone and wrapping around my spine, pulling me in. I wanted to throw my phone across the room, break it, anything to make it stop. But I couldn't look away. I was terrified to check if the whisper was only in the stream, or if it was outside my door, waiting. The camera inched closer, and I swear I could feel it. My door started to creak open in the stream. I stared at the screen, barely breathing, as the camera entered my room. There was my bed, exactly how I'd left it, but no one was there. It was as if the camera itself was watching me from within my own house. And then it turned to face my closet. Now here's the thing, I'd always kept my closet shut. Always. I hated the idea of it standing open at night, with that darkness just sitting there like it could swallow me whole. But as I watched the stream, I saw that the closet door was cracked open. It wasn't much, just a sliver of darkness peeking out, but I knew that wasn't how I'd left it. The camera lingered on that open closet door, and the whisper started again, only louder this time. Come closer. It was like the voice was talking to me directly. I reached out, hand shaking, and locked my bedroom door, pressing my ear against it to listen for any sounds on the other side. All I could hear was my own breathing, ragged and panicked, but in the stream that whispering continued, relentless. Don't make me come to you. The screen went black. No warning, no countdown, it just ended. I threw my phone onto my bed and backed up until I hit the wall, trying to process what I'd just seen. But before I could even think straight, there was a loud knock on my closet door. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't just one knock. It was a slow, rhythmic tapping, like someone was deliberately trying to get my attention, waiting just long enough between each tap to send a shiver down my spine. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I clenched my fists, trying to gather the courage to move, to breathe. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. There couldn't be anything in there. It was just clothes, some old boxes, nothing else. But the knocking continued, steady, like it was counting down to something. Then it stopped. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, waiting for the silence to settle, but just as I thought it was over, I heard it. Soft, almost too quiet to hear, but there. A faint, scraping sound, like something was scratching from inside the closet, trying to get out. I felt paralyzed, trapped in my own room, cornered by whatever was hiding just a few feet away. Then, as quickly as it started, the sound stopped, leaving me in complete silence. I waited, holding my breath, straining to hear anything. But there was nothing. The tension hung in the air, thick and suffocating, and I knew I had to check. I couldn't just sit there, knowing something might be hiding in my closet. It felt insane, like I was willingly putting myself in danger, but I couldn't take the silence anymore. I took a few slow steps toward the closet, each step feeling heavier than the last. My hand shook as I reached for the handle, and for a split second I thought about turning back. But I couldn't. I needed to know. I yanked the door open, heart pounding, expecting something. But it was empty. Just my clothes, boxes, a mess of old stuff, gathering dust. I let out a shaky laugh, feeling a weird mix of relief and embarrassment. Of course, there was nothing. It was just a trick of my mind, fueled by whatever the hell I'd seen on that stream. I was being paranoid, right? But as I turned to close the door, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. At the very bottom, just barely peeking out from under a pile of shoes, was a single piece of paper. I picked it up, hands trembling, and unfolded it. Scrawled across the page in jagged, uneven handwriting were 4 words that sent a chill down my spine. I can still see you. After finding that note, I didn't know what to do. It felt like I was being toyed with, like someone, or something, had planned every move I'd make, every reaction I'd have. That note was a message, a warning. I can still see you. It was simple, direct, and terrifying. I slept with the lights on that night, my phone clenched in my hand, but no stream, no messages came. Just an uneasy silence that felt more threatening than any sound. The next morning, I convinced myself that I needed to do something. Sitting around waiting for the next horror to unfold wasn't an option anymore. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? That I'd seen a shadow in a stream and found a creepy note in my closet? I knew they'd never believe me. But I couldn't just sit back and let this thing keep playing its game. So I did the only thing I could think of. I started searching for anyone who might know something about this. Anyone who could help me. I went back to the same dark web forums where I'd first seen that stream link, scrolling through thread after thread, looking for clues, something, anything. After hours of digging, I found a thread buried deep, barely visible. The title was strange, just a series of numbers. 3:33. My pulse quickened. It was the exact time when everything started, the time I kept seeing over and over again. I clicked. The post was brief, but it hit me hard. If you've seen the shadow, it's already too late. It knows where you are. It watches, waits, and when the time is right, it will reveal itself to you. pray that it doesn't. I felt a chill run down my spine. I wasn't dealing with some prank or hacker. This was something else. I wanted to tell myself it was just another creepy story, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the post was talking directly to me. The replies below the post were just as unsettling, people sharing their own encounters, describing shadows, whispers, and notes left where they shouldn't be. One reply stood out to me. Do not look at it directly. If you acknowledge it, it grows stronger. And whatever you do, never try to communicate with it. My hand shook as I clicked away, slamming the laptop shut. I'd already made that mistake, hadn't I? Watching those streams, reacting to every message, every noise, I was giving it exactly what it wanted. And now, I didn't know how to take it back. That night, I went to bed, feeling like I was under surveillance, like eyes were on me even when I couldn't see them. I tried to ignore every creak, every rustle of the house settling, but it felt like I was being pulled in, like the silence was reaching out to me. Then, at exactly 3:33 a.m., my phone buzzed. Another message, don't ignore me. I wanted to throw my phone across the room, scream, anything to make it stop. But instead, I just sat there staring at the words, trying to steady my breathing. I knew I shouldn't reply. I knew that responding would only make it worse. But something in me snapped. I was tired of being scared, of hiding. So, with a mixture of anger and terror, I typed out, "What do you want from me?" Seconds later, the reply came, "Let me in." My heart pounded so loud I thought it would burst. Let it in? Into what? My house? My mind? I didn't know, but every fibre of my being screamed at me to stop, to end this now. I powered off my phone, threw it into a drawer, and sat in the dark, willing the fear to go away. But the silence pressed down on me, thick and suffocating. And then, from the corner of my room, I heard it. A whisper. It was faint, barely a sound, but it was there. A low, raspy whisper, repeating the same words I'd seen on my screen. "Let me in!" I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out, but it only grew louder, closer. It sounded like it was right next to my ear, like it was breathing the words directly into my head. "Let me in." I felt something cold brush against my arm, like a hand tracing along my skin, and I bolted upright, flicking on the light. The room was empty, just me and the stale air. But the whisper lingered, echoing in my mind, a relentless chant that wouldn't fade. I barely slept that night, and when I finally drifted off, it wasn't much of a rest. I dreamed of shadows slipping through my house, lurking in every corner, watching me. Every time I closed my eyes, that whisper was there, looping over and over. By morning, I was exhausted, barely holding it together. When I finally checked my phone, there was another message waiting for me. I hesitated, every instinct telling me not to open it, but I couldn't help myself. It was a video, no title, no explanation, just a video file. With my hands trembling, I opened it. The footage was shaky, like someone was filming while moving, but it wasn't just anyone's house, it was mine. The camera moved through the living room, past the hallway, toward my bedroom. I watched, horrified, as it approached my closed door, lingering just outside. I could hear that faint breathing again, ragged and slow, like something was waiting to come in. Then slowly, the door creaked open in the video. The camera moved into my room, sweeping across my bed, the walls, everything exactly as I'd left it. The only thing missing was me. My bed was empty, as if I'd just vanished. The video cut off suddenly, leaving me staring at the screen, cold sweat dripping down my back. It felt like a warning, a promise. That shadow, whatever it was, wanted me gone. I don't know how to explain it, but I could feel it. The same presence I'd sensed before, lurking just outside my vision, waiting. That night, I packed a bag and left. I didn't know where I was going, just that I couldn't stay in that house. I spent the night in a cheap motel on the edge of town, telling myself I'd be safe, that whatever it was couldn't find me there. But at 3:33 a.m., my phone buzzed again, a picture this time. My house, with my bedroom window wide open. The message below it read, "Running won't help. I'll find you anywhere." And in the reflection of the window, I could just barely make out a shape. A tall, dark figure, twisted and stretched, staring straight at the camera. I spent the rest of that night at the motel, watching the door, my heart racing every time I heard footsteps in the hall or a car pulling up outside. I kept telling myself it was over, that I could just leave and disappear, but the thought of that photo lingered in my mind, the open window, the figure reflected in the glass. Somehow this thing had followed me, reached me in a place I thought was safe. It knew where I was. The next morning, I drove aimlessly, trying to put as much distance between me and that shadow as I could. I ended up in a small town miles away, practically in the middle of nowhere, and checked into another cheap motel. It was the kind of place where no one asks questions, and that was exactly what I wanted. I switched off my phone, pulled the curtains tight, and spent the whole day locked inside, hoping that if I just waited it out, this nightmare would finally end. For a while, I actually started to believe I might be safe. I didn't get any messages, didn't feel that suffocating presence I'd grown so used to. By evening, I even managed to fall asleep for a couple of hours. But right around midnight, I woke up to the sound of scratching. At first, I thought it was just a stray animal or something, but the sound was too deliberate, too steady, like someone dragging their fingers slowly across the outside wall. It circled the room, moving from one side to the other, like it was searching for a way in. I sat there, holding my breath, every nerve on edge, waiting for it to stop. But the scratching kept going, like a clock, ticking down to something, closer and closer to the door. I backed away, reaching for my phone without thinking, desperate for any kind of distraction. When I turned it on, the first thing I saw was a notification, a new message. My hands shook as I opened it. Thought you could hide? Attached to the message was a picture of the motel door. My motel door. The scratch marks were there, clear as day, running all along the frame, as if something had been clawing to get in. I couldn't breathe. I knew without a doubt that whatever it was standing just outside, waiting for me to make a move. I locked myself in the bathroom, shoving towels under the door, hoping it would be enough to keep that thing out. I sat on the cold tile floor, phone clutched in my hand, waiting for the sun to come up. I could still hear the scratching, softer now, almost like it was taunting me. Around 3:33 a.m. the sound stopped, leaving me in a silence that was somehow worse. I didn't dare open the door until morning, and even then I barely had the nerve to peek out. But when I finally did, there were no signs of anything unusual. The door looked untouched. No scratch marks, no dirt, nothing to prove that anything had been there at all. But I knew it wasn't over. I knew it was still watching me, still waiting. I spent the next few days on the run, moving from town to town, trying to stay ahead of whatever this was. But no matter how far I went, it always found me. The messages, the pictures, the whispers that echoed in my head every night at exactly 3:33 a.m. It was like I was being hunted by a shadow I couldn't escape, something that slipped through the cracks of reality itself. The messages got more direct, more invasive. One night I received a video. I opened it, half dreading, half expecting what I'd see. The footage was shaky, taken from a low angle, like someone was filming from the ground, looking up at my face. In the video, I was asleep in bed, completely unaware. The room was dark, but I could just make out my figure in the faint glow from my phone on the nightstand. And then I saw it. Standing in the corner, barely visible, was a tall, twisted shape. Its limbs were too long, its body thin and distorted. It stood there, motionless, watching me as I slept, like it was savoring every moment, every breath. The video ended abruptly, leaving me staring at the screen, feeling more exposed than ever. It had been in my room, inches from where I slept, and I hadn't even known. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. No matter where I went, no matter what I did, it would always find a way to get closer. That night, I barricaded the door, stacked every piece of furniture I could find against it. I sat there in the dark, watching the shadows creep along the walls, wondering if one of them might peel away and take form. And then, at exactly 3:33 a.m., I heard a whisper. "Let me in." The words slithered into my mind, soft but insistent, repeating over and over. I tried to block it out, covering my ears, but it was like the sound was coming from inside my own head. "Let me in! Let me in!" I felt a presence behind me, cold and suffocating, like the air had been sucked out of the room. I couldn't move, couldn't even turn around. The whisper grew louder until it was all I could hear, drowning out every other thought. I felt something cold brush against my shoulder, and I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted out of the room, barely able to see where I was going. I ran down the empty hallways of the motel, out into the night, not stopping until I was far from the building. I ended up on the side of the road, gasping for air, my body shaking with fear. I didn't go back. I left everything, my bag, my phone, even my car. I didn't care. I just kept walking, putting as much distance as I could between me and that thing. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stop. Not until I was sure I was alone. But as dawn broke, I realized something chilling. Every time I looked over my shoulder, every time I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye, I felt it there, just out of sight, waiting. It was like a shadow following me no matter where I went, just beyond my vision, always there, always watching. And then, in the silence of the morning, I heard it again. That same whisper, soft but clear, right next to my ear. "You can't hide from me." After that night, I knew there was no escaping it. No matter how far I ran or how carefully I tried to hide, it was always there. I could feel it, lurking just beyond my sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The strange thing was, I didn't even have my phone anymore. I'd abandoned it back at the motel, left it behind with everything else that tied me to my old life. But I still felt its presence, the shadow creeping closer with every step I took. I walked for hours that day, miles through empty roads and quiet fields, hoping I could outpace the dread clawing at the back of my mind. I ended up at an old abandoned house on the outskirts of some forgotten town. The place looked like it hadn't seen life in decades, the paint peeling, windows covered in grime. But it was the only shelter I could find, and by then I was so exhausted I didn't care. I just needed somewhere to hide, somewhere to finally rest. I crept inside, making my way through dust-choked rooms and creaky floors until I found a corner where I felt hidden enough. I sat there, back against the wall, watching the shadows stretch across the room as the sun dipped below the horizon. I told myself that this place was empty, that there was no way it could find me here. But deep down, I knew it was just a matter of time. The hours dragged on, each one ticking by like the countdown to something I couldn't see. Midnight came and went, and I started to believe, for a brief, desperate moment, that maybe I'd finally lost it. Maybe this was over. But then, as the clock hit 3:33 a.m., I felt it. A chill settled over the room, thick and suffocating, like the air itself was watching me. My skin prickled, every nerve on edge as I realized I wasn't alone. It was there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, its gaze pressing down on me, relentless and unyielding. And then the whisper returned, louder and clearer than ever. "Let me in!" The words echoed through the empty house, each syllable dripping with malice. I tried to cover my ears, tried to block it out, but it was no use. The whisper grew louder, filling every corner of my mind until it was all I could hear. "Let me in. Let me in." I knew then that I had a choice. I could keep running, keep hiding, or I could face it, once and for all. Maybe I was tired, maybe I was just desperate, but something inside me snapped. I stood up, shaking, my voice barely a whisper, as I spoke into the empty room. "What do you want from me?" The silence that followed was absolute. For a moment I thought I'd made a mistake, that I'd invited it in, opened myself to whatever horror it had planned. But then slowly the darkness in the room seemed to shift, taking shape, solidifying into a figure just a few feet away. It was tall and thin, its limbs stretched out in unnatural angles, a twisted, distorted silhouette. Its face, or what should have been a face, was just a blank void, a deep, empty darkness that seemed to swallow the light around it. It didn't have eyes, but I could feel its gaze, cold and invasive, piercing straight through me. The figure took a step closer, and I felt my body lock up, frozen in place. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, but I was trapped, rooted to the spot as it loomed over me. And then, for the first time, I heard its voice, no longer a whisper, but a deep, guttural rasp that seemed to echo from somewhere far beyond. "You invited me in." The words sent a jolt of terror through me, but I couldn't respond, couldn't move. I realized then that every time I'd opened those messages, every time I'd watched the streams, I'd been feeding it, giving it the invitation it needed to enter my life. I'd been playing its game without even realizing it, letting it in one piece at a time. The figure leaned closer, its blank face mere inches from mine. "You were the one who looked. You were the one who let me in. And now, I'm here." It reached out a hand, its fingers long and skeletal, stretching toward my face. I felt a cold, suffocating pressure close in around me, like the very air was being sucked away. My vision blurred, dark spots dancing at the edges, and I knew I was losing consciousness. But just before everything went black, I heard one final whisper. "Now you're mine." I don't know how long I was out. When I finally came to, the house was empty, silent, as if nothing had ever happened. The figure was gone, but I could still feel its presence, lurking just beneath the surface, like a shadow attached to my soul. I stumbled out of the house, dazed and disoriented, trying to shake off the feeling, but it wouldn't go away. I've been wandering ever since, moving from place to place, never staying anywhere for too long. It doesn't matter where I go, it's always there, lurking in the corners, waiting for the right moment to appear. I see it in every reflection, every shadow that flickers at the edge of my vision, and no matter how hard I try to ignore it, I know it's only a matter of time before it comes for me again. People say you can't be haunted by something that doesn't exist, but I know the truth. I invited it in, and now it's part of me, a shadow I can never escape. Maybe one day I'll find a way to get rid of it, to end this nightmare once and for all, but until then, I'm trapped. I paid for a dark web service that promises to enhance my senses, Now I'm hearing voices everywhere. I'm not the kind of guy who believes in paranormal stuff. Ghosts, spirits, all that. It's just stories to me. I'm a skeptic by nature, one of those people who thinks everything has a logical explanation. But I also love a good thrill, and that's where I get my kicks. Exploring the dark corners of the internet, finding out-of-the-box experiences just to see what's out there. It started with a curiosity for strange experiences. I dabbled in odd forums, read creepypasta, and even poked around on the fringes of the deep web, mostly harmless stuff. Then one night I stumbled upon this strange service. I was scrolling through forums when I found a thread titled "Boost Your Senses, See the World Like Never Before." Now I've read enough internet horror stories to know when something is off. But this post had a weirdly scientific tone to it. Someone claimed they'd used a service that enhanced their senses, specifically hearing and sight. They went on about how the world looked sharper, colours more vibrant, sounds richer and clearer. The post went on for paragraphs describing how everything felt supercharged. I remember thinking, man, that'd be wild. Imagine hearing stuff from a distance or noticing things no one else could. It sounded like a superpower, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't tempted. But there was a small part of me that thought this was just some scam to get money off the gullible. After a couple of beers, though, my skepticism faded and the curiosity took over. I figured if it was a scam, I'd just lose some money, no big deal. So I followed a sketchy link from the post. I know I should have stopped there, but the page was well made, surprisingly sleek for a deep web service. There was a lot of pseudo-scientific mumbo-jumbo about neural amplifiers, frequency enhancement, and some nonsense about accessing sensory potentials. It read like the kind of thing someone would say to sound smart, and I found myself laughing. The price, however, wasn't a joke, $500 for a single session. The page claimed I'd be given a 2-hour treatment that will unlock your dormant sensory abilities, which I found hilarious. But I was in that buzzed, reckless mood, so I clicked purchase. They asked for a lot of personal info, my full name, address, even my height and weight, which I thought was weird. But it was already weird enough that I didn't question it. After sending the payment, I got an email from an anonymous address with instructions. The message was simple. Sit in a quiet room at exactly 3 a.m. tonight, close your eyes, and focus on the rhythm of your heartbeat. We will handle the rest. I actually laughed out loud reading it. It sounded like some kindergarten meditation exercise, but I figured, why not? I'd already paid. When the clock struck 3 a.m., I was sitting in my room, lights off, a little groggy but determined to see it through. I closed my eyes, leaned back, and tried to focus on my heartbeat. At first, I felt kind of stupid, just sitting there in silence, like I was waiting for a magic trick. But a couple of minutes in, something odd happened. It was faint, like a whisper I couldn't quite catch. I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me. But then the sound started to get clearer. I realized I was hearing noises from outside my apartment. I could hear a dog barking 4 buildings over, the hum of a distant engine, even the faint clatter of someone dropping a pan in the building across the street. I opened my eyes, but the sounds didn't stop. My room was dead silent, but I could hear everything going on around me, like I was wearing noise-cancelling headphones, tuned into the world outside. It was intoxicating. It's hard to describe, but there was something so surreal about hearing things I shouldn't be able to hear. Every sound was crystal clear. It was like my ears had been tuned to a new frequency. I decided to test it. I walked to the window and looked down at the street. I could hear the flicker of the streetlight, which didn't make sense. It wasn't even that close. And the weirdest part, I could hear people's conversations like they were right next to me. 2 teenagers were whispering to each other on the corner. A man was muttering to himself about losing his keys, and I could even hear someone humming a lullaby to their kid in the building next door. I stayed up until dawn, just listening. Every creak, every distant footstep, every muffled voice. It was like I'd unlocked a whole new dimension of sound. I was hearing things I'd never paid attention to before, and it was amazing. But things took a strange turn the next day. I woke up exhausted, my head throbbing from the lack of sleep, but the world was still loud. I could hear everything, my neighbor's TV blaring 2 rooms over, the pipes creaking down the hall, even someone's muffled laughter through the wall. It was overwhelming. And the more I tried to tune it out, the louder it seemed to get. By the time night fell, I was a wreck. Every little sound felt amplified. I tried earplugs, but they didn't help. I could still hear things that were happening far outside my apartment, even things that shouldn't be audible. And that's when I started hearing the whispers. At first, they were faint, just a hushed voice, like someone was standing outside my window. I thought maybe it was just my overstimulated brain, but as the night went on, they got clearer. It was like someone was right behind me, murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. I'd turn around, but there was nothing there. Just empty air. By 3 a.m. I was back in bed, lying in the dark, clutching my ears. But the voices wouldn't stop. They were whispering things, not quite words, but almost like suggestions or commands. I couldn't make sense of them, but the tone was unsettling, urgent, like they were trying to tell me something. And then, as suddenly as they'd started, the whispers stopped. Just like that. Total silence. I thought maybe I'd finally gone deaf, but no. There were still distant sounds, traffic in the distance, faint rustling. The world had just gone back to normal, leaving me in silence, alone and completely rattled. By morning, I was starting to doubt the whole thing. Maybe it was all in my head, a kind of sensory overload. But the silence didn't last. And by the next night, the voices came back. And this time they were calling my name. I didn't get much sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear it. My name, whispered over and over, echoing from nowhere and everywhere at once. It wasn't loud or obvious. It was like a breeze carrying a message just beneath the edge of hearing. Sometimes it was gentle, like someone calling me from another room. Other times it was sharp, hissing like a warning. I kept telling myself it was in my head, but I wasn't sure if I believed it anymore. There was something about the voice. No, voices plural. They overlapped sometimes, like a crowd whispering in sync. The scariest part was that I recognized some of them. They sounded like people I knew, voices I hadn't heard in years, voices I'd almost forgotten. My old friend from high school, my ex-girlfriend, even my mum's voice, though she passed away years ago. They all blended together, each one calling my name like they were watching. By morning, I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. My apartment was eerily quiet, but I was on edge, waiting for the voices to return. I started to regret everything, paying for that ridiculous service, letting curiosity get the best of me. I wanted to reach out, cancel it, ask for my money back, anything. But the email I'd received was gone, deleted from my inbox like it had never existed. I couldn't even find the forum thread where I'd discovered the service. It was like I'd stumbled into some black hole of the internet and left without a trace. I tried to get back to normal, or at least distract myself. I went out, walked around town, did all the usual things to remind myself I was still sane. But something was off. I couldn't shake this feeling, like I was being watched. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me, like shadows lingering at the edge of my vision. I'd hear faint whispers when I walked by strangers, like their voices were tuned just for me. I'd hear people say things like, "He knows," or "He's listening," and every time my stomach dropped. One night, a few days after it all started, I decided to visit my friend Mark. I hadn't told him anything yet. I figured he'd think I was going crazy, but I couldn't take it anymore. I just needed to be around someone, anyone who could ground me. I arrived at his place, and he welcomed me in with a smile. He looked normal, relaxed, but as soon as I stepped inside, something felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy, like a presence lingered in the room with us. We sat down, cracked open a couple of beers, and started chatting. For the first few minutes, it was fine. I started to relax, thinking maybe this was just what I needed, a distraction, a friend. But then, in the middle of our conversation, I noticed something strange. Mark's lips were moving, but his voice was wrong. He was talking about work, his new boss, but his voice sounded different. It was like I was hearing two versions of him. One that was right in front of me, casual, friendly, and another, darker version, muttering things underneath his words. Things that didn't make any sense, words like leave and danger and trap. At one point I could have sworn he said, "You shouldn't have listened." Did you say something?" I asked, interrupting him. He looked at me, confused. "What? I was just saying I got promoted." "No, I mean, did you say anything else?" I was starting to feel crazy, but I had to ask. He just shrugged. "Dude, you all right?" I tried to laugh it off, but I could feel my heart pounding. I could still hear the whispers, layered beneath his words, like a second voice hiding just out of reach. It was telling me things I couldn't quite make out, but I felt their meaning in my gut. I wasn't safe. I made up some excuse to leave, and Mark looked concerned, but he didn't push it. As I walked out, I heard it again, my name, whispered from the shadows in his hallway, a soft, distant voice that made my skin crawl. I sped up, practically running to my car, desperate to get away. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, lurking just behind every corner. That night, the voices returned, louder than ever. They weren't just calling my name now, they were saying things, phrases that barely made sense but filled me with dread. "You shouldn't have come back. He knows now. Don't look behind you." My lights flickered, casting shadows that twisted and stretched in the corners of my room. I was sweating, hands trembling, listening to a dozen voices overlapping in whispers that felt like needles in my brain. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to drown them out, but it was useless. They got louder, hissing in my ear, filling the room until I couldn't hear anything else. Just when I thought I was going to lose it, the whispers fell silent. The air felt still, too still. I opened my eyes, half expecting to see someone standing there, but my room was empty. I could still feel them, though, those voices waiting just beyond the silence. I didn't dare move, and then, from right next to my bed, I heard a single whisper, so clear it could have been someone leaning down and speaking directly into my ear. "They're watching you now." The next day, I knew I couldn't stay in my apartment. I packed a bag, threw in whatever I could, and left. I wasn't even sure where I was going, I just needed to be somewhere else, anywhere but there. The voices followed me everywhere. I'd hear them in passing conversations, see glimpses of shadows at the edge of my vision, and every time I'd feel that icy grip of fear. But I couldn't keep running. Every time I stopped, the whispers returned, and they were getting bolder, closer, almost like they wanted me to hear them. Leaving town didn't help. I thought that putting some distance between me and my apartment might shake whatever was haunting me, but the voices only grew more persistent. The first few hours on the road were quiet, a dead kind of silence that had me almost believing I'd finally gotten away. But that night, as I pulled into a cheap motel somewhere miles from home, they returned. And this time, they weren't just whispers. They were aware. I was unpacking my things when I heard my name echoing softly in the empty room. It wasn't like before. This time it sounded close, like someone was right outside the door. I froze, listening, but everything went silent again. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, loud and fast, like it was trying to drown out the quiet. I told myself I was just hearing things, that this was all some psychological trick, that my brain was misfiring. I couldn't let myself believe otherwise because the thought of something real out there watching me was too much to handle. I tried to go about my night as normal, but as I brushed my teeth, splashing cold water on my face, I noticed something strange in the bathroom mirror. At first, it was just a flicker, like my own reflection was out of sync. But then I realized it wasn't me at all. My reflection was standing there, staring back with hollow, sunken eyes, lips twisted into the faintest hint of a smile. I backed away, heart hammering, but the reflection didn't move. It kept staring, a still image frozen in the mirror. And then, slowly, the mouth opened. "Why did you look for us?" The voice was guttural, raspy, like broken glass scraping against metal. I stumbled back, tripping over my bag, eyes glued to the mirror as my reflection's mouth kept moving, whispering words that sounded like a chant. My head started to spin, the room feeling smaller, tighter, until I couldn't breathe. I snapped out of it, scrambling to my feet and throwing a towel over the mirror. I didn't want to see whatever that was staring back at me. I just needed to get out of there. I grabbed my keys, left my bag, and rushed out of the room. The cold night air hit me like a slap to the face, jolting me awake, but the dread still clung to me like a second skin. I decided to sleep in my car that night, just in the parking lot, not caring how it looked. The voices followed me there too, whispers rising from the darkness, scratching against the windows, curling around me in a cocoon of sound. I closed my eyes, willing it all to go away, praying that I'd wake up to silence. But sleep was impossible. Just as I felt myself drifting, I heard a familiar sound, a faint tapping, like fingers rapping against glass. My eyes shot open and I realized it was coming from the back window. I was alone. The lot was empty, no one around, but the tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it turned into a pounding, like fists slamming against the glass. I didn't dare look, didn't want to see what was back there. I just kept my head down, breath hitching, too afraid to move. And then, as suddenly as it started, the pounding stopped. Everything was quiet again, except for the soft sound of breathing right behind my ear. I shot up, turning around, but there was no one. Just the empty back seat, dark and silent. I don't know how long I sat there, gripping the steering wheel with shaking hands, but eventually the fear gave way to exhaustion. I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the windshield, warm and blinding. I thought maybe I was safe, that whatever nightmare I'd been trapped in was over. But as I glanced at the rear-view mirror, I noticed something strange. A faint, dark smudge on the back window. I got out to check, my stomach twisting, and froze when I saw what it was. A handprint smeared across the glass, like someone had pressed their hand against it in the middle of the night. And written beneath it, in jagged, uneven letters, were the words, "Don't look." I wiped the window clean, heart racing, and got back in the car. I didn't want to think about what it meant. I just needed to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between me and that motel. As I drove, the voices returned, faint but familiar, whispering in a strange rhythmic pattern like they were counting down to something. "One step closer. You're almost there." Their words were nonsense, but there was a hint of anticipation in their tone, like they were waiting for something to happen. Every time I thought about stopping, about turning back, the voices would grow louder, urging me forward, pulling me deeper into some invisible snare. Eventually, I found myself on an empty road, surrounded by thick, dark woods on either side. I didn't remember turning off the highway, but somehow I was here. My car's GPS was dead, screen flashing uselessly. I felt trapped, the silence pressing down on me, broken only by the whispers that had grown into a low hum. The road stretched out endlessly, disappearing into the darkness. I kept driving, heart pounding, but the road never changed, just winding on, like I was looping through the same stretch of forest over and over. And then I saw something in the distance, a figure standing by the side of the road, motionless, watching me. I slowed down, dread pooling in my stomach, but something compelled me to keep moving forward, like I didn't have a choice. As I got closer, I realized the figure was familiar. It was me, or something that looked like me, standing there with a blank, empty gaze, staring into the car with hollow eyes. I tried to speed up, to leave it behind, but the figure kept pace, flickering in and out of sight like a broken film reel. No matter how fast I went, it was always there, waiting around the next bend, staring at me with that same empty, soulless expression. The voices grew louder, almost frantic, filling my head with words I couldn't understand, images that made no sense. It felt like they were trying to push me somewhere, guiding me towards some unknown destination. And all the while, my reflection watched. A silent, twisted version of me that seemed to know exactly where I was headed. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the road finally came to an end, opening up into a small clearing. There, in the center of the clearing, was an old, abandoned cabin, the windows shattered, the door hanging loosely from its hinges. I don't know why, but I felt like I was supposed to go inside, like I'd been drawn here for a reason. The voices fell silent, the air thick and heavy, pressing down on me with a weight that made it hard to breathe. My car was dead, engines sputtering to a halt, leaving me stranded in the clearing with that cabin looming ahead. And as I stepped out, I could feel something watching me, hiding just beyond the shadows, waiting for me to cross the threshold. With every step I took, I heard my name echoing softly, almost like a warning, urging me to turn back. But something deeper, darker, was pulling me forward, an invisible hand guiding me into the unknown. I stood there in front of the cabin, feeling its shadow stretch out toward me, swallowing up everything else. It wasn't a big place, just a crumbling wooden structure with moss clinging to the walls and shattered windows like empty eyes. But something about it felt alive, like it was waiting. I could feel it pulling me closer, an invisible tether wrapping around me, tightening, leaving me no choice but to go inside. I stepped forward, my footsteps crunching on the overgrown gravel path, each step heavier than the last. The silence was thick, unnatural, like even the forest around me was holding its breath. And then I heard it, faint at first, almost like a heartbeat pulsing from somewhere deep within the cabin. I don't know why I kept moving. My mind was screaming at me to turn back, to run, but my body felt like it was moving on its own, each step bringing me closer to that rhythmic, pulsing sound. I reached the door, hand shaking as I pushed it open, and the smell hit me, a damp, mouldy stench that made my stomach churn. Inside, the air was thick with dust, swirling in the faint beam of moonlight that trickled through a broken window. The interior was a mess. Furniture strewn about, old newspapers littering the floor, walls lined with strange symbols scratched into the wood. And at the center of it all was a single chair facing the doorway, like it had been waiting for me. On the seat was a tape recorder, ancient, and covered in dust. I stepped closer, fingers hovering over the play button, heart pounding like a drum in my chest. I pressed play, and the recorder whirred to life, crackling with static. For a moment, there was nothing, just the hiss of white noise, but then a voice cut through, cold and hollow. "We've been waiting." My breath caught, my whole body freezing as the voice continued, low and distorted like it was coming from somewhere far, far away. "You shouldn't have looked for us. You don't belong here." The voice was familiar in a way that made my skin crawl, and I realized why, because it was my own. I was listening to myself, my own voice speaking back to me, twisted, dark, almost unrecognizable. The static crackled again, and then I heard something else. A soft whisper, layered beneath my own voice, almost like a chant. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound filled my head, pressing against my skull like it was trying to seep inside. My vision blurred, and for a moment, everything went dark. When I blinked back to awareness, I found myself standing in front of the chair, fingers brushing against the strange symbols carved into the armrests. The whispers grew louder, filling the room, rising to a fever pitch. I could hear my name again, over and over, each syllable laced with urgency, desperation. And then, in a single, deafening moment, the voices stopped. The silence was so sudden, so absolute, that I almost fell to my knees. I was alone in the room, the shadows stretching out like dark fingers reaching for me. But I wasn't truly alone. I could feel something watching me, its gaze pressing down from every corner of the room. And then I saw it. A figure in the corner, barely visible, like it was melting into the darkness. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking, studying me like I was some strange, fragile thing. I backed away, but my feet felt heavy, like they were glued to the floor. I tried to look away, but my gaze was locked onto the figure. It tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion, and I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. I could hear a faint hum, almost like a lullaby, echoing from somewhere in the distance. Then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, it spoke. "We hear you." The words sent a shiver down my spine, a bone-deep chill that froze me in place. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat like a countdown ticking away. And then, in the dim light, I saw its face. It was mine. Or at least, it looked like mine. My features twisted and stretched, eyes sunken and hollow, mouth curled into a faint, haunting smile. It was like looking into a nightmare version of myself. Something pulled straight from the darkest corner of my mind. It stared at me, unblinking, that same eerie smile frozen on its face. And then it spoke again, its voice a low, chilling echo of my own. "You wanted to hear us. Now you always will." The figure began to melt back into the shadows, its face fading, but the smile lingered, hanging in the air like a ghost. And then the whispers returned, louder this time, pressing in from all sides, filling the room with a suffocating chorus. They weren't just calling my name anymore, they were inside my head, their voices weaving through my thoughts, turning them against me. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe, the sound filling every inch of my mind, drowning me in their words. I stumbled back, tripping over something and landing hard on the floor. The whispers grew louder, relentless, their voices blending together into a maddening cacophony that twisted and warped, taking on a life of its own. I felt like I was sinking, like the room was closing in around me, dragging me down into the dark. Just as I thought I'd lose myself completely, I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest. It was like a shock, jolting me back to reality. I gasped, the air rushing into my lungs as the voices faded. leaving me in a cold, empty silence. I looked around, dazed, my heart racing, but the room was empty. The cabin was silent, the shadows still, as if nothing had ever happened, but I could feel it, their presence lingering, just out of reach, waiting. I stumbled to my feet, my legs weak, and staggered out of the cabin into the cold night air. The silence pressed down on me, thick and oppressive, but I could still hear faint whispers at the edge of my mind, like they were following me. I didn't look back. I ran, stumbling through the trees, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could still feel their gaze on me, watching from the shadows, their voices echoing softly in my head, promising that this wasn't over. And as I reached my car, fumbling with the keys, I heard a final whisper, clear and unmistakable. "We're always with you now." I don't remember driving back to town. All I know is that when I finally reached my apartment, my hands were shaking, my mind buzzing with the remnants of those voices. I slammed the door behind me, locking it, but I knew it wouldn't keep them out. I could feel them, their presence lingering in the silence, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. I thought I'd escaped, but the whispers haven't stopped. Every night they grow louder, slipping into my thoughts, filling my dreams with shadows. And every time I close my eyes, I see that face, my own, twisted and hollow, smiling back at me from the darkness. I tried reaching out to the service, searching for any trace of it online, but it's gone, vanished without a trace, like it never existed. But I know it's real. I barely sleep anymore. The whispers are always there, lurking in the background, growing louder every time the sun sets. It's like they're waiting, like they've got all the time in the world to unravel me. Every night, I try to drown them out with music, white noise, anything to fill the silence. But it's no use. They slip through the cracks, seeping into my mind like a poison, an infection I can't shake. Sometimes, I catch myself talking back to them, answering the voices in the quiet hours of the night. It feels natural now, like they're part of me. I'll ask them questions, trying to understand what they want, but they only respond in riddles, fragmented sentences that don't make sense, phrases that sound like they're pulled from memories that aren't mine. But last night was different. It was around 3 a.m. when the whispers started shifting, changing from the usual murmur of half-heard voices. This time, they sounded organized, like they were trying to tell me something specific. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, listening as the voices melded into a single, clear sentence. "Look at the window." I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, staring at the dark outline of my window. The room was silent, but I could feel a presence outside, waiting. Every instinct screamed at me to stay where I was, but the whispers grew insistent, each one echoing the same command. "Look at the window." Slowly, I turned, my heart in my throat, and pulled back the curtain just enough to peek outside. My apartment is 3 stories up, so I didn't expect to see anyone there. But when I looked, my stomach dropped. Outside the window, pressed up against the glass, was my face. It stared back at me, eyes wide and unblinking, lips pulled into a twisted smile. But there was something wrong. Its eyes were pitch black, hollow, and its skin was pale, almost translucent, like it was made of shadows. It was me, but it wasn't. It looked like a version of me from some dark, twisted reality. I stumbled back, breathing hard, but the face didn't disappear. It stayed there, watching, its smile stretching wider, almost like it was laughing. And then, in a voice that sounded like a distorted version of my own, it spoke. "You wanted to hear us. Now you'll never be alone." The words echoed through the room, filling every corner, bouncing around inside my head, until I couldn't tell if they were coming from the figure outside or from inside my own mind. I covered my ears, desperate to block it out, but the voice grew louder, pressing against my skull, drilling into my thoughts. "We're with you now." My vision blurred, the room spinning, and I fell to my knees, clutching my head. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that I couldn't escape, each one clawing at my sanity, tearing down every barrier I tried to build. They weren't just speaking to me, they were inside me, filling every inch of my mind, my thoughts no longer my own. I don't remember how long I sat there, rocking back and forth, trying to drown out the voices. When I finally looked up, the figure at the window was gone. But the feeling hadn't left. The presence, the weight, it was still there, pressing down on me, suffocating. I stumbled into the bathroom, hoping the cold water would snap me out of it, make the voices go away, but when I looked into the mirror, I knew it was too late. My reflection stared back, but it wasn't me. It wore my face, but its eyes were dark, empty, a void that seemed to stretch on forever. And as I watched, the reflection smiled, that same twisted, mocking smile I'd seen at the window. I backed away, but the reflection didn't move. It just watched, that smile never faltering, a silent, taunting reminder that I was no longer alone. I could feel them inside, their whispers swirling through my mind, whispering secrets and lies, twisting every thought until I couldn't tell where they ended and I began. And then, in a voice barely louder than a breath, the reflection spoke, its tone calm, almost gentle. "There's no going back. We're part of you now." I stumbled out of the bathroom, closing the door behind me, but I could still feel its gaze, its presence lurking just beyond the mirror. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that it was just a trick of the mind, a hallucination. But deep down, I knew the truth. I'd opened a door I couldn't close, invited something into my life that I could never escape. Now, every time I close my eyes, I see that face, my own face, twisted and hollow, watching me from the darkness. The whispers never stop, never fade, filling every quiet moment with their endless, taunting murmur. They're always there, just out of sight, just out of reach, reminding me that I'm never truly alone. And every night, when the clock strikes 3 a.m., I feel them drawing closer, pressing against the edges of my mind, waiting for the moment when they'll finally break through. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. I feel myself slipping, losing pieces of who I am, my thoughts no longer my own. It's like they're taking over, slowly, one whisper at a time, filling every corner of my mind until there's nothing left but them. And as I sit here writing this, I can feel them watching, waiting. Their whispers are growing louder, each one blending into the next, a relentless chorus that fills every inch of silence. They're inside me now, woven into my thoughts, my memories, my very being. And I know deep down that this is only the beginning, because once you let them in, they never leave. And now, I'll never be alone again.